The cruelest promises are the ones made to save the people you love. I didn't understand those words until the day Vincent Holloway looked across a ballroom filled with politicians, judges, and business leaders and calmly destroyed my future with a single sentence. Graham will marry you in 48 hours. The orchestra kept playing. Crystal glasses still clinked together. People smiled through conversations they no longer heard because every eye had shifted toward me. I was 28 years old, 6 months pregnant, wearing the engagement ring Vincent himself had slipped onto my finger 3 months earlier. My hand instinctively rested over my stomach, as if my baby somehow understood the room had suddenly become colder. I searched Vincent's face for a joke, a smile, any sign that this was another calculated test of loyalty. There was nothing. His expression remained steady, almost gentle, but his tired eyes carried a weight I had never seen before. Graham Mercer stood beside him, perfectly still in his dark suit. 15 years as Vincent's chief bodyguard had trained him never to question an order, yet I caught the smallest change in his breathing. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled once before relaxing again. That tiny movement told me everything. He hadn't expected this either.
"I'm sorry," he whispered.
"I think I heard you wrong." Vincent looked directly at me. "You heard me exactly as I intended." Around us, whispers spread through the ballroom like wind across dry leaves. Some guests looked confused. Others looked relieved. A few exchanged knowing glances that only made my pulse race faster. My engagement had never been about romance. Everyone knew that. But they believed it symbolized stability inside an organization built on carefully negotiated trust. Now Vincent himself was tearing that symbol apart in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Why?" I asked. It was the only word my mind could find. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and handed Graham a small velvet box. Graham opened it slowly. Inside rested a simple platinum wedding band that reflected the chandelier lights with quiet elegance. My heartbeat stumbled. This wasn't a threat made in anger. This had been planned. Every detail, every witness, every second. Graham finally spoke, his deep voice almost reluctant. "Sir." Vincent lifted one finger, stopping him before another word could escape. "This is the last order I will ever ask you to obey without explanation." Silence followed. Even the orchestra seemed distant now. Graham looked at me instead of Vincent. There was no triumph in his eyes. No excitement. Only the exhausted expression of a man carrying a burden that wasn't his to refuse. I wanted to hate him for standing there. I wanted someone to argue. Someone to stop this impossible conversation before it became real. But no one moved. Vincent slowly removed the engagement ring from my trembling hand. He closed my fingers around it for one brief moment before placing it into Graham's palm. "Protect her," he said quietly. "Protect both of them." Then he turned away and walked toward the ballroom exit without looking back. I watched the doors close behind him, convinced that the man everyone feared had just sacrificed the one thing he cared about most. I simply didn't know why. The drive home felt longer than it should have, even though Graham never took a wrong turn. Rain traced quiet lines across the windshield while the city lights blurred into pale streaks of gold and white. I sat in the passenger seat with both hands resting over my stomach, unable to decide whether I was angry, frightened, or simply exhausted. Graham kept both hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He had not spoken since we left the ballroom. The silence between us was not uncomfortable because of what it contained. It was uncomfortable because of everything it refused to reveal. Finally I broke it. "Did you know?" He answered without looking at me. "No." His voice carried the certainty of a man who had no reason to lie. "Did you ask him why?" Another pause. He did not give me the chance. I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You have spent 15 years protecting that man, and you accepted an order to marry his fiancée without demanding an explanation?" Graham tightened his grip on the wheel. "I accepted an order to protect someone." That answer irritated me more than it should have. "Those are not the same thing." "No," he admitted quietly. "They are not." The rain grew heavier as we crossed the bridge toward the quieter neighborhoods outside the city. Instead of turning toward Vincent's estate, Graham exited onto a narrow coastal highway lined with weathered cedar trees and small family businesses that had already closed for the night. 15 minutes later he pulled into the driveway of a modest gray cottage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The porch light glowed warmly against the damp evening air. Wind chimes swayed gently beneath the roof, their soft notes blending with the distant sound of waves. I stared through the window. This is not your boss's property. No. It is yours. He nodded once. I bought it 8 years ago. I followed him inside, expecting polished marble floors and expensive furniture like every other home connected to Vincent's world. Instead I found worn hardwood floors, overflowing bookshelves, handmade quilts folded neatly across a faded couch, and family photographs turned face down on a fireplace mantel. The house smelled faintly of cedar, coffee, and fresh bread. It felt lived in, human. Graham carried my overnight bag upstairs before returning with a glass of water and a small white bottle. Your prenatal vitamins, he said. I looked at the bottle confused. How did you know which ones I take? His expression remained calm. Vincent made sure I had everything you would need before tonight. My heartbeat quickened again. Before tonight. That meant Vincent had prepared this long before he announced it. Every room, every detail, every step had already been arranged. I walked toward the living room window and looked out at the dark ocean. The steady rhythm of the waves usually brought people peace. Tonight they only deepened the questions filling my mind. I am not staying here because someone else made a decision for me, I said without turning around. If I remain, it is because my child deserves stability until I understand the truth. Graham stood quietly behind me for several seconds. You will always have the freedom to leave. I finally turned to face him. Do you believe that? He hesitated for the first time since I had met him. It lasted only a heartbeat, but I saw it. I hope so, he answered. Before I could ask what that meant, headlights swept across the front windows. A black sedan slowed briefly outside the cottage before continuing down the coastal road without stopping. Graham stepped closer to the glass, his expression sharpening with quiet concern. Stay away from the windows, he said, and for the first time that night, I realized someone besides us already knew exactly where I was. I barely slept that first night. Every creak of the old cottage sounded louder than it should have. Every gust of ocean wind against the windows pulled me awake before I could drift into real rest. By sunrise I gave up pretending and wrapped an old wool sweater around my shoulders before stepping onto the porch. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before me, gray beneath a cloudy sky, its waves rolling toward the shore with patient determination. The salty air filled my lungs, and for the first time in days I felt my heartbeat slow. I rested one hand over my stomach as the baby shifted gently beneath my palm. I wish I knew how to protect you, I whispered. The screen door opened quietly behind me. Graham stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to me without saying anything. Hot chamomile tea. Not coffee. He had remembered what my doctor recommended without being reminded. Thank you, I said softly. He nodded once before leaning against the porch railing several feet away, leaving enough space for me to feel comfortable. We stood there listening to the waves until curiosity finally defeated my pride. Why did you buy this place? He watched the horizon for several moments before answering. I thought I might have a family one day. The honesty surprised me. What happened? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Life happened. He did not elaborate, and something in his voice told me not to push further. Instead I noticed the small details surrounding us. A wooden birdhouse hanging from an old maple tree. A faded fishing rod resting beside the porch steps. Flower boxes. Waiting for spring blooms. None of it matched the life I had imagined for a man whose career revolved around protecting one of the most powerful men in the city. This house belonged to someone who believed in quiet mornings instead of grand displays. Before either of us could continue, Graham's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the calm expression I had begun recognizing disappeared. We need to leave, he said. Now. My pulse quickened. What happened? Vincent wants to see us. Then why do you look worried? He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Because he never asks twice. 40 minutes later we arrived at a private medical building tucked behind rows of oak trees instead of one of Vincent's office towers. There were no luxury cars filling the parking lot, only a handful of ordinary sedans and a quiet ambulance parked near the entrance. I looked toward Graham. This is a hospital. Yes. I thought we were meeting Vincent. We are. Confusion settled over me as we entered through a side door. Nurses greeted Graham by name. They did not look frightened of him. They smiled with the familiarity reserved for someone they had seen many times before. One even asked whether he had remembered to eat breakfast. Graham thanked her politely. I stared at him in disbelief. This was another side of him I had never imagined. We stopped outside a private room. Graham hesitated before opening the door, almost as though he needed a moment to prepare himself. Inside, Vincent stood beside a window overlooking the water. He looked older than he had only 2 nights earlier. The confidence was still there, but the strength behind it seemed thinner somehow. An unopened folder rested on the small table beside him. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. Hazel, there is something I should have told you months ago. Then he slowly reached for the folder, and for the first time since this impossible journey began, I realized the truth he had hidden might be far more painful than the lies everyone already believed. Vincent rested his hand on the unopened folder but did not slide it toward me. Instead, he looked through the hospital window at the gray Atlantic. Beyond the cliffs, as though the answer he had carried for months was somewhere beyond the horizon. There are moments, he said quietly, when protecting someone means allowing them to hate you. I folded my arms across my chest, fighting the ache building behind my eyes. Then explain it. Stop speaking in riddles. He finally turned toward me. The confidence that had once filled every room around him had been replaced by something I never expected to see on his face. Weariness. Deep, unshakable weariness. I cannot explain everything today. My frustration spilled over. You asked another man to marry your fiancée in front of hundreds of people. You moved me into his home before I even had time to think. Now you tell me you still cannot explain. Graham remained silent near the doorway, giving neither of us permission to hide from the truth. Vincent lowered himself carefully into a chair beside the window. The simple movement seemed to require more effort than it should have. A nurse quietly entered the room, adjusted the intravenous medication beside his chair, smiled politely at all 3 of us, and left without interrupting the conversation. My stomach tightened. This was not a routine visit. Vincent noticed my eyes lingering on the medical equipment and gave a faint smile that never reached his eyes. I suppose there is no point pretending anymore. He picked up the folder and slowly opened it, revealing several medical reports instead of legal documents. I recognized enough of the language to understand they belonged to him. Multiple specialist evaluations, cardiology consultations, long-term treatment plans. He slid only the first page across the table toward me. 3 months ago, my doctors told me that my heart was failing faster than they expected. The words echoed in the quiet room. I read the report once. Then again. My hands began to tremble.
No, he whispered.
They are wrong. Vincent gave a small shake of his head. I spent a great deal of money trying to prove exactly that. I looked up at him. Does anyone else know? Only Graham, my physician, and my attorney. I turned toward Graham. He lowered his eyes for a moment before answering the question I had not spoken aloud. He asked me to keep his confidence. Suddenly dozens of moments from the past few months rearranged themselves inside my memory. The cancelled meetings. The shorter workdays. The unusual fatigue he tried so hard to hide. The engagement that had seemed rushed from the very beginning. None of it had been random. Then why become engaged to me at all? I asked softly. Vincent's expression softened. Because I believed I still had enough time. Tears blurred my vision before I realized they had fallen. I was no longer grieving a broken engagement. I was grieving a future that had quietly disappeared before anyone else knew it existed. Vincent carefully closed the medical folder and rested both hands on top of it. Hazel, there is still one truth I cannot tell you. Not yet. If I reveal it before the right moment, I will place you, your child, and Graham in greater danger than you can imagine. Before I could respond, someone knocked gently on the door. Graham crossed the room and opened it. Owen Pike, Vincent's longtime attorney, stepped inside carrying a sealed envelope with an expression I had never seen on his composed face. He handed it directly to Vincent and spoke only 6 quiet words. The trust has been challenged already. Vincent closed his eyes for a brief second, then looked at me with unmistakable urgency. We are running out of time. The drive back to the cottage passed in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Before it had been filled with confusion. Now it carried the weight of unfinished truths. I kept replaying Vincent's words in my mind. He had believed he still had enough time. Those 7 words echoed louder than the rain tapping softly against the windshield. Graham kept both hands on the wheel, watching the narrow coastal road while the ocean disappeared behind thick afternoon fog. Neither of us spoke until we reached the cottage. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something unusual. The flower pot beside the front door had been moved several inches from where I remembered leaving it. It seemed insignificant, yet Graham stopped instantly. His eyes narrowed. He crouched beside the pot before carefully lifting it. Tucked underneath was a small folded piece of paper wrapped in clear plastic to protect it from the rain. He unfolded it without changing expression, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten again. "What does it say?" I asked. He hesitated before handing it to me. There were only 5 typed words. "We know where she sleeps." A chill spread through my entire body despite the warm sweater around my shoulders. Graham quietly folded the note again and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Pack a small bag," he said calmly. "We are leaving for a few days. Running away will not answer my questions." "No," he replied. "But staying here may prevent you from asking them." His voice remained controlled, yet I recognized something new inside it. Not fear for himself. Fear for me. Within 20 minutes we were back on the road, heading farther north along the coastline instead of returning to the city. The highway gave way to smaller roads lined with weathered fishing docks, family diners, and quiet neighborhoods where children still rode bicycles after school. Nothing about the landscape suggested the dangerous world Vincent supposedly controlled. It felt wonderfully ordinary. We stopped outside a modest white house overlooking a small harbor where dozens of fishing boats rocked gently with the tide. An elderly woman opened the front door before Graham even knocked. "You finally listened," she said with a warm smile that immediately softened the tension around us. She embraced Graham tightly before looking at me. "And you must be Hazel." I blinked in surprise. "You already know my name?" She smiled kindly. "Vincent asked me to prepare the guest room weeks ago." Weeks ago. Again those words. Everything had been arranged long before that impossible announcement inside the ballroom. The woman introduced herself as Eleanor Brooks, a retired schoolteacher who had known Graham since he was a boy. Family photographs filled every wall. Homemade quilts covered the furniture. The kitchen smelled like fresh cinnamon bread cooling beside an open window. It was impossible to imagine this peaceful home connected to Vincent's world in any way. That evening, Eleanor served vegetable soup and warm bread while insisting I eat enough for 2 people. Graham even smiled once when she scolded him for skipping dessert. It transformed his entire face. For a brief moment I saw the man he might have become if life had carried him somewhere else. Later that night, unable to sleep again, I wandered quietly into the hallway. A faint light glowed beneath the partially open study door. Inside, Graham stood alone holding an old framed photograph. I could not see the faces clearly, only that it showed a young woman standing beside a little girl on a sandy beach. His thumb brushed gently across the dusty glass before he whispered so softly I almost missed it. "I could not save you. I will not fail again." In that single heartbreaking sentence, I realized the greatest secret inside this house might not belong to Vincent at all. Morning arrived with the smell of salt, fresh bread, and coffee drifting through Eleanor's little house. For the first time in weeks, I woke without the constant pressure of wondering who might be watching through a window. I found Eleanor humming softly while she watered herbs on the kitchen windowsill. Graham was already outside repairing a loose section of the porch railing with the quiet concentration of someone who preferred fixing broken wood instead of broken conversations. "He always needs something to keep his hands busy," Eleanor said as she noticed me watching through the window. "He has been that way ever since he came home." I looked at her. Came home from where? Her smile faded just enough for me to notice. From a chapter of his life that changed him forever. Before I could ask another question, She gently changed the subject by handing me a warm blueberry muffin. The kindness felt so natural that it almost hurt. After breakfast, I walked slowly toward the harbor while Graham followed several steps behind, never close enough to make me feel guarded and never far enough to lose sight of me. Fishing boats rocked gently against their docks while children laughed nearby, tossing breadcrumbs to seagulls. The ordinary rhythm of the town made everything else feel impossible. How could secrets, powerful enough to rearrange lives, exist alongside places this peaceful? I stopped beside a small flower stand outside the local market. Bright wildflowers filled weathered wooden buckets. Without thinking, I reached toward a bundle of white daisies. The owner smiled. Those were just delivered this morning. Before I could ask the price, Graham quietly placed a few bills on the counter. I frowned. You do not have to buy me flowers. He looked almost uncomfortable. They are not from me. Then why? He hesitated. Because you smiled for the first time since I met you. I did not know how to answer that. We continued walking until we reached the end of the pier where the wind carried the scent of the ocean around us. Eleanor said you came home changed, I said carefully. Graham rested both hands on the wooden railing. She worries too much. She also cares about you. He nodded slowly. She is one of the few people who still does. The honesty surprised me again. Every layer I uncovered revealed someone completely different from the quiet bodyguard. I thought I understood. Who was the woman in the photograph? His eyes remained fixed on the water. For several long seconds I thought he might refuse to answer. Instead he spoke so quietly that the waves nearly carried his words away. Her name was Melissa. He swallowed once before continuing. She believed I could build a peaceful life after I left the military. I believed it too. What happened? He closed his eyes briefly. A fire destroyed our home while I was away on assignment. By the time I returned, I had lost both her and our little daughter. My chest tightened. Suddenly every sleepless night, every careful gesture, every silent act of protection made painful sense. He had not been protecting me because Vincent ordered him to. He was protecting the family he never had the chance to save. Before either of us could speak again, my phone vibrated inside my coat pocket. The screen showed a blocked number. I almost ignored it until another message appeared beneath the first. There was no greeting, no signature. Only one sentence that made every heartbeat stumble. Stop looking for answers before the baby loses everything. My fingers refused to move after reading the message. The screen seemed heavier than the phone itself, as though those 11 words carried the weight of every secret Vincent had refused to tell me. Graham noticed the color leave my face before I could hide it. What happened? He asked quietly. I handed him the phone without speaking. His eyes scanned the message only once before he powered the device off completely. We are leaving the harbor. Who sent it? I asked as we started walking back toward Eleanor's house. I do not know. That is not true. He looked ahead instead of at me. I do not know which person sent it. I know exactly what kind of people would. The answer settled heavily between us. By the time we reached the front porch, Eleanor had already sensed something was wrong. She did not ask questions. She simply closed every curtain in the house and placed a fresh kettle on the stove as though ordinary routines could still protect ordinary lives. Late that afternoon, Owen Pike arrived carrying a leather briefcase and an expression that looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him. Graham invited him inside while I remained in the living room beside the window, absent-mindedly turning the pages of the old flower journal I had brought from my shop. Pressed between its pages were dried daisies, lavender stems, and faded notes I had written years ago, reminding myself that beautiful things could survive difficult seasons. Owen placed several documents across the dining table. Rumors are spreading quickly, he said. Some members believe Vincent has lost his judgment. Others believe Hazel manipulated him into rewriting his succession plans. I looked up immediately. That is ridiculous. Owen nodded. Truth has never traveled as fast as suspicion. Graham remained calm. Who benefits from those rumors? Owen answered without hesitation. Anyone hoping to divide Vincent's allies before he can explain himself. Then let him explain, I said. He keeps asking for more time while everyone else invents their own version of the truth. Owen sighed softly. Sometimes revealing the truth too early destroys the very people it is. Meant to protect. Hearing Vincent's own words repeated by another man only deepened my frustration. That evening the rain finally stopped. A pale orange sunset spread across the harbor, painting the water with gentle light. I stepped outside alone, needing fresh air more than more unanswered questions. At the edge of the yard stood an old wooden mailbox that had probably weathered 50 winters. Something white rested inside. I frowned, certain it had been empty earlier. Carefully I reached inside and found a plain envelope with my name written across the front in neat handwriting. No stamp. No return address. Just Hazel. My heartbeat quickened as I opened it. Inside rested a single photograph. It showed Vincent standing beside a much younger man whose smile looked strangely familiar. They stood outside an old farmhouse, laughing with their arms around each other's shoulders. Across the back someone had written one sentence in blue ink. Brothers by blood. Brothers until the end. Before I could turn the photograph over again, Graham's voice called sharply from the porch. Hazel, come inside now. I looked up just in time to notice a dark sedan parked across the road with its headlights off. It remained there only a few seconds before quietly pulling away, but whoever had been inside had seen me holding the photograph, and somehow I knew that simple piece of paper had become the most dangerous thing I owned. That night no one slept. Graham checked every door and window twice before quietly placing the old photograph and the mysterious envelope inside a locked desk drawer in Eleanor's study. Owen remained at the dining table, reviewing legal documents under the warm glow of a small reading lamp while Eleanor insisted everyone drink another cup of tea, as though kindness could still hold the world together. I sat beside the fireplace with my flower journal resting on my lap, unable to stop staring at the faded photograph burned into my memory. Vincent and the younger man looked so alike that no stranger could mistake them for anything except family. The smile they shared carried none of the caution I had always seen in Vincent's eyes. Whoever his brother had been, he had once represented a life untouched by fear. His name was Daniel, Owen said quietly without looking up from his papers. I raised my head. You knew him? He nodded. Not well, but well enough to remember how different Vincent was whenever Daniel entered a room. Graham remained silent near the front window. Owen continued after a long pause. Daniel believed people could build honest lives even after growing up surrounded by difficult choices. Vincent admired him for that. What happened to him? I asked. Owen slowly removed his glasses and folded them carefully. I promised Vincent I would never answer that question until he gave permission. The familiar frustration returned immediately. Every answer seemed to lead to another locked door. Before I could argue, Graham's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer it, speaking so quietly that I caught only fragments of the conversation. Understood. No, she does not know. We will leave before sunrise. When he returned, his face carried the same controlled calm I had come to recognize whenever something serious had changed. We are going back tomorrow, he said. Vincent requested another meeting. Is he finally ready to tell the truth? I asked. Graham hesitated. I believe he wants to. And what changed? Someone else has started searching for the same answers. Those words lingered long after the conversation ended. Early the next morning we drove back toward the city beneath pale blue skies. The ocean gradually disappeared behind us as familiar streets returned. Instead of taking us directly to the hospital, Graham turned toward an older part of town where brick buildings, family-owned bakeries, and quiet bookstores lined the sidewalks. He stopped in front of my flower shop. The handwritten sign I had painted years ago still hung above the window. Seeing it made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. I had almost forgotten what ordinary life looked like. The front door was locked exactly as I had left it, yet something inside immediately caught my attention. One small lamp near the register was glowing. I was certain I had switched it off before everything changed. Graham unlocked the door and entered first. Nothing appeared disturbed. Fresh flowers had wilted inside their buckets, and the familiar scent of roses and eucalyptus filled the room. It looked untouched except for one object resting neatly on the checkout counter. My old pressed flower journal was supposed to be with me. Yet another journal, identical in size and color, waited beneath the lamp. A cream-colored ribbon held it closed. My name was written across the cover in Vincent's unmistakable handwriting. With trembling fingers I untied the ribbon and opened the first page. Pressed carefully between two sheets of paper was a single white daisy beside a handwritten note that read, "If you are reading this, then someone has already begun rewriting our family's story before I could tell you the truth." My hands trembled as I turned the page. Vincent's handwriting remained steady, elegant, and painfully familiar, as though he had expected this exact moment long before I ever imagined it. "Hazel, if this journal has reached you, then events are moving faster than I hoped. Trust Graham even when he cannot explain himself. Distrust anyone who insists they already know the whole truth." I swallowed hard. Those words felt less like instructions and more like an apology. Carefully, I continued reading. Between the next pages rested copies of legal documents, photographs, and handwritten notes connected by colored tabs. None of them mentioned me directly until I reached a sealed envelope tucked inside the back cover. My name appeared again across the front. Graham stepped beside me but made no attempt to take it. "It was meant for you," he said quietly. I broke the seal. Inside was a certified laboratory report dated almost 7 months earlier. Across the top, in bold letters, I read the words genetic parentage analysis. My breathing slowed as my eyes searched the final page. Then the world seemed to stop. The report clearly stated that Vincent Holloway was excluded as the biological father. I read the sentence again. Then a third time. It did not change. I looked at Graham, unable to speak. He already understood. "You knew," I whispered. His silence answered before his words did. "Vincent told me after the results came back." "Then why did everyone believe?" My voice broke apart before I could finish the question. Graham lowered his eyes. "Because Vincent wanted them to." Nothing inside the shop made sense anymore. Every rumor, every whispered accusation, every public assumption had been built upon something Vincent already knew was false. I stared at the report resting in my hands. Then whose child am I carrying? Graham closed his eyes for one brief moment. "That is the truth Vincent wanted to tell you himself." Before I could ask another question, the bell above the shop door chimed softly. All three of us turned at once. Owen Pike entered carrying another sealed folder against his chest. His usually composed face had disappeared beneath unmistakable urgency. "Vincent collapsed this morning," he said quietly. My heart sank. "Is he alive?" Owen nodded. "Yes, but he insisted I bring this to you before anyone else could interfere." He placed the folder on the counter beside the laboratory report. A red wax seal secured the flap. Pressed into the wax was the Holloway family crest I had only seen once before. Owen looked directly at me. "Vincent instructed me that only you may open it." My fingers hovered above the seal while every instinct told me my life was about to divide into two separate parts. Everything before this envelope and everything after it. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded the first page. At the very top, written entirely in Vincent's own hand, was a single sentence that stole every breath from my lungs. "Hazel, before you learn who the child's father is, you must first understand why my brother Daniel gave his life to protect your mother." The paper slipped slightly between my fingers as I continued reading Vincent's letter. Every line felt heavier than the last, as though the truth itself had been waiting years for someone brave enough to uncover it. "Daniel was not only my younger brother," Vincent wrote. "He was the only man who believed our family could choose compassion over fear. He fell in love with a young woman named Caroline Whitmore long before either of them understood how dangerous that love would become." My heart stopped. Whitmore. My mother's maiden name. I looked up at Graham, unable to hide the shock spreading across my face. He had not read the letter. He simply watched me with quiet concern, waiting for me to continue. I lowered my eyes back to the page. "Your mother never wanted the life my family represented. Daniel promised her they would leave together. They planned to disappear and build an ordinary future where no child would inherit the burden of our name." Tears blurred the ink for a moment before I blinked them away. Ordinary. It was the same word that had followed me ever since I met Graham. The same dream everyone seemed willing to sacrifice for someone else. Vincent's handwriting continued across the next page. "Their plan failed, but not because they stopped believing in each other. Circumstances separated them before they could leave. Daniel made me promise that if Caroline ever had a daughter, I would watch over that child without allowing her to become part of our world." I covered my mouth with one trembling hand. My entire childhood suddenly looked different. The unexpected scholarships. The anonymous donations that had saved my flower shop during difficult seasons. The mysterious kindnesses I had never been able to explain. They had never been coincidences. Someone had quietly honored a promise for decades. Owen spoke softly from across the room. Vincent never missed your birthday. He never attended, but he always knew where you were. Fresh tears rolled down my cheeks. Why did he never tell me? Owen answered with deep sadness. Because he believed knowing the truth would only place you in greater danger. I turned another page. A smaller envelope had been attached beneath the letter with careful tape. Inside rested an old photograph. My mother stood smiling beneath an apple tree while a young man knelt beside her with his hand resting gently against her shoulder. I recognized him immediately. Daniel. The resemblance to Vincent was unmistakable, but unlike his older brother, Daniel's eyes carried effortless warmth. On the back of the photograph my mother had written only one sentence. Someday our child will know what hope looks like. My breath caught. Our child. My thoughts raced in every direction at once. Does this mean? I whispered before the question faded unfinished. Graham stepped closer but remained careful not to interrupt the moment. Keep reading, he said gently. I unfolded the final sheet tucked inside the envelope. Vincent's handwriting became less steady, as though exhaustion had finally reached his hand. Hazel, there is one final misunderstanding I must correct before anyone else tells you their version of our history. Daniel was your father. I was never protecting my former fiancée. I was protecting my brother's daughter. That is why I asked Graham to marry you. I could no longer guarantee I would live long enough to keep the promise I made beneath Daniel's hospital bed 29 years ago. The room fell completely silent. Even the ticking clock above the flower shop counter seemed to disappear as I lowered Vincent's letter into my lap. I had spent my entire life believing I understood where I came from. Now every memory had shifted beneath my feet. Vincent had never tried to replace my father. He had spent nearly 3 decades honoring a promise to him. I looked toward Graham, searching for something solid to hold onto inside a world that no longer felt familiar. He stepped closer but still gave me enough space to breathe. I wanted you to hear it from Vincent, he said quietly. That was always his wish. I nodded slowly. For the first time since this impossible journey had begun, I no longer saw Graham as the man who had taken someone else's place. I saw the man who had accepted a promise that was never his responsibility simply because someone he respected had asked him to protect a family. Owen carefully gathered the scattered documents into neat piles before speaking. There is more. My heart tightened again. More. He removed another folded page from the bottom of the folder. Vincent instructed me to wait until you finished reading the letter. I unfolded the page. It contained a handwritten timeline beginning 29 years earlier, documenting every scholarship, every anonymous donation, every unexpected opportunity that had quietly appeared. Throughout my life, my first college grant, the emergency loan that had saved my flower shop after a severe winter, the insurance payment that mysteriously covered my mother's medical bills years before she passed away. I remember believing strangers had simply been kind. They had not been strangers. They had been Vincent keeping his promise from a distance without asking for gratitude or recognition. Tears slipped down my cheeks as I whispered, he never wanted me to know. Owen shook his head gently. He wanted you to live freely. There is a difference. Before anyone could say another word, Graham's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, answered immediately, and listened without interrupting. I watched his expression become impossibly still. When the call ended, he slipped the phone into his jacket and looked directly at Owen. The hospital has been evacuated. Owen frowned. Why? Vincent insisted on leaving. He is not strong enough to travel. Graham nodded once. That did not stop him. My pulse quickened. Where did he go? Graham looked at me with quiet certainty. He is coming here. Less than 20 minutes later, a familiar black sedan stopped outside the flower shop. The driver remained inside while Vincent slowly stepped onto the sidewalk with the help of a simple wooden cane I had never seen him use before. He refused every offered hand and walked through the front door under his own strength. The moment our eyes met, I crossed the room without thinking. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I wrapped my arms around him. He hesitated only briefly before returning the embrace with gentle care. "I am sorry," he whispered. "You deserved the truth long ago." I pulled back just enough to look at him. "You kept your promise." A faint smile appeared on his tired face. "Not yet." Confused, I searched his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small brass key in my hand. "Everything you still need to know is locked inside Daniel's old workshop." Before I could ask where it was, the front windows reflected the slow arrival of 3 unfamiliar vehicles stopping across the street, and Vincent's peaceful expression vanished for the first time since he had entered the shop. Vincent did not look toward the vehicles immediately. Instead, he quietly closed my fingers around the small brass key, as though nothing outside the flower shop mattered more than that simple piece of metal. "Do not lose it," he said. "It opens the only place no one thought to search." Graham stepped beside the front window without drawing attention to himself. His calm voice never rose above a whisper. 3 vehicles. For people outside. They are waiting instead of approaching. Owen slowly gathered every document from the counter and placed them back inside his briefcase. No one panicked. Somehow that frightened me more than if they had. Vincent finally turned toward the window. His reflection stared back at him through the afternoon light. "They came sooner than I expected," he murmured. "Who are they?" I asked. He looked at me instead of the street. "People who believe history can be rewritten if enough evidence disappears." The words settled heavily inside the quiet shop. My gaze drifted toward the rows of flowers lining the shelves. For years I had believed this little store was the safest place in my world. Today it had become the center of every secret my family had carried for decades. Graham rested one hand gently against my shoulder. "Hazel, I need you to trust me." I looked up at him. There was no fear in his eyes, only quiet determination. It reminded me of the promise I had overheard him make while holding the old photograph of Melissa and their daughter. "I could not save you. I will not fail again." This time I understood those words were no longer about the past. They were about us. Vincent smiled faintly as though he had reached the same realization. "Daniel chose well," he said softly. Graham looked almost uncomfortable receiving the compliment. "I only kept my word." Vincent shook his head. "You gave my family something I never could. A future." My throat tightened. For the first time since all of this began, the impossible marriage no longer felt like an order. It felt like the final act of trust between 2 men bound by the same promise. A few moments later the bell above the shop door rang gently. Everyone looked up at once. It was not one of the strangers from outside. Eleanor stepped inside carrying a paper bag filled with warm cinnamon rolls from the bakery near the harbor. She stopped as soon as she sensed the tension in the room. Her eyes moved from Vincent to Graham and finally to me. Without asking a single question, she walked over and placed the bag on the counter. "Whatever happens next," she said with quiet confidence, "no family should face it hungry." Vincent laughed softly for the first time since I had met him. It was a tired laugh but a genuine one. "Daniel always said kindness survives longer than fear." Eleanor smiled. He was right. Outside, the vehicles slowly pulled away from the curb one by one without anyone stepping out. Graham continued watching until they disappeared around the corner. "They are leaving," I whispered. "For now," he replied. Vincent reached into his coat one last time and removed a folded map marked with a small circle along the northern coastline. He handed it to me beside the brass key. "The workshop is here. Inside you will find Daniel's journals, your mother's letters, and the last piece of the story." I unfolded the map carefully. In the lower corner Daniel had written a single sentence years before in faded blue ink. "If love ever becomes hidden, follow the lighthouse." At that exact moment the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, filling the flower shop with warm golden light, and I realized our family's story had never truly been about power. It had always been about ordinary people quietly keeping extraordinary promises until someone was finally brave enough to carry them forward. 6 months later the lighthouse stood exactly where Daniel had promised it would, watching over the Atlantic with the same quiet patience that had carried our family through decades of secrets. Winter had surrendered to early spring, and the wind carried the scent of salt mixed with fresh wildflowers blooming along the cliffs. I stood outside my reopened flower shop arranging white daisies in a weathered wooden bucket, while my newborn son slept peacefully inside his stroller beside the front window. Life had become wonderfully ordinary again, and after everything that had happened, ordinary felt like the greatest gift anyone could receive. Graham emerged from the shop carrying 2 paper cups of hot tea. He handed one to me before gently adjusting the blanket covering the baby. Every morning he repeated the same quiet routine without ever being asked. He checked the locks before sunrise, made breakfast, remembered every doctor's appointment, and somehow always knew when I needed silence instead of answers. The man who once believed he had failed his family had become the safest place my son and I had ever known. Customers gradually returned to the little flower shop, filling it once again with birthdays, anniversaries, apologies, and fresh beginnings instead of unanswered questions. Most of them never knew the extraordinary story hidden behind the simple bouquets they carried home. They only saw a smiling florist, a kind husband, and a sleepy baby who seemed happiest whenever the front bell chimed. That was exactly how Vincent had wanted it. 3 weeks after my son was born, Owen arrived with one final envelope. "He asked me not to deliver this until your family had found peace," he said quietly before leaving us alone. My hands trembled as I unfolded the familiar stationery. Vincent's handwriting looked weaker than before, but every word remained unmistakably his. "Hazel, if you are reading this, then I have finally kept the promise I made to Daniel. I could not give you the childhood he dreamed about, but I hope I protected your future well enough that your son will never have to inherit our fears. Tell him his grandfather believed kindness was stronger than power. Tell him his great-uncle spent a lifetime trying to prove that love survives even when truth must wait. And tell Graham that the greatest act of loyalty was never following my orders. It was giving my family the peaceful life I could never build myself." Tears slipped quietly onto the paper as I folded the letter closed. Graham wrapped one arm gently around my shoulders without speaking. Words were unnecessary. Together we walked toward the harbor just before sunset, carrying a small bouquet of white daisies and lavender. We placed the flowers beneath the lighthouse overlooking the sea where Daniel's journals had been found, and where Vincent had asked for a simple memorial instead of a grand monument. There were no marble statues, no speeches, only the sound of waves meeting the shore and a family finally standing together without fear. As we turned to leave, our son stirred softly in Graham's arms before opening his eyes toward the fading light. Graham smiled down at him with quiet wonder, and I realized something that no secret, no promise, and no passing season could ever change. Families are not remembered because of the power they once held. They are remembered because someone chose to love long after every reason to stop had disappeared.